People like you do not belong here." The words left Victoria Harrington's mouth with sharp precision, delivered in a tone she had perfected through years of quiet exclusion. A split second later, her son Ethan hurled a warm chocolate croissant at the back of Dr. Aisha Reynolds's head. It struck with a soft but jarring thud, sending streaks of chocolate through her hair and down her collar. Pain shot across her scalp. Humiliation followed with equal force. For a brief moment, the room seemed to pause, holding its breath as if aware that this single act would later unravel the Harrington family's power, prestige, and legacy. Their downfall had begun, and none of them knew it yet. Before going into this story, take a moment to tell me where you are watching from, and please subscribe to the channel and give me a like, because this story is one that speaks to dignity, justice, and the cost of cruelty. The morning had started like any other at Brentwood Elite Country Club, a sanctuary of privilege built on manicured perfection and decades of quiet gatekeeping. The annual summer philanthropy brunch brought together Los Angeles's most influential families. They arrived in pristine white attire that whispered wealth and tradition. To them, elegance was a language, power was a silent currency, and exclusion was an unspoken rule woven into the institution's DNA. Yet on this morning, a quiet presence disrupted that seamless choreography. Dr. Aisha Reynolds stepped onto the terrace with a calm that concealed a lifetime of wounds inflicted by the very people who claimed superiority with a smile. She wore dark jeans, a simple navy blazer, a low ponytail, minimal makeup, and no obvious signs of status. She was a billionaire, but no one noticed. She was the CEO of Reynolds Tech, but no one cared. She was the decision-maker on a $2.2 billion real estate contract that could change fortunes overnight. But to the people surrounding her, she was simply a black woman out of place. Aisha had agreed to attend the event under one condition. She wanted to remain anonymous. She wanted to see the club's true culture without the polished mask reserved for public relations. She had learned through experience that the most beautiful spaces were often the ones where disrespect hid in plain sight. So she took a quiet seat near the window. She opened her iPad. She set her phone to record, and she observed, 3 tables away, the Harrington family sat at the most coveted spot on the terrace. Victoria arranged her posture for the perfect photograph. Edward whispered into his phone about final stage bidding. Ethan scrolled TikTok with restless entitlement. When Victoria noticed Aisha, the shift in her expression was immediate. Her face tightened with a brief, unmistakable flash of disdain. She leaned toward her husband, lowering her voice just enough to make her judgment seem effortless, yet loud enough to ensure it reached its intended audience. "Edward, look at that. Who let her in?" Her words cut through the soft music like a blade. Edward glanced over, irritation rising in his chest, to him. The club was sacred territory. It was where deals began. It was where connections bloomed. It was where people like him affirmed their standing. A stranger in simple clothes triggered something deeper than annoyance. It challenged his sense of ownership. Aisha felt their eyes on her, but she did not look up. She stayed still, grounded by years of discipline. For a moment, she imagined herself at Stanford again, the day a professor told her, "You are not a fit for this place." She had carried those words like a bruise that never faded, even after proving him wrong. Here she was again, 45 years old, a national leader in defense technology, targeted by a 13-year-old child who learned cruelty like it was a family tradition. Ethan rose with a spark of delight. He grabbed a chocolate croissant. His mother's approving smile pushed him forward. The pastry struck Aisha's head, and laughter followed. Victoria clapped. "Perfect shot. Sweetheart. That is what happens when people forget their place." Edward stood up, pointing at Aisha with a stern, commanding gesture that revealed generations of inherited arrogance. "You need to leave, now, before I call security." Aisha slowly reached for a napkin. Her hands trembled, though only slightly. She dabbed chocolate from her neck. In that moment, she was no longer simply a CEO or a mother or a woman preparing to donate $7 million to a program meant to elevate young minds. She became a reflection of every unjust moment she had endured. And she knew this time would be different. Still, she remained composed. She turned and met Victoria's eyes, calm, steady, unflinching. Victoria rose, heels tapping across the marble as if the floor itself recognized her authority. She loomed over Aisha, her perfume heavy, her tone mocking. "I am the chair of the social committee. I do not recall inviting you." Aisha spoke calmly. "Mr. Charles Beaumont invited me personally." Victoria laughed. "A verbal invitation? How convenient." She reached down, snatched one of Aisha's printed documents, and tore it into pieces. Ethan stepped forward, eager to participate. He kicked Aisha's briefcase, her tablet, pens, and confidential contracts scattered across the floor. He filmed every second, speaking into his phone with adolescent cruelty. Point of view. When a random thinks she belongs at Brentwood Elite. Aisha knelt, her dignity intact even as the evidence of their cruelty lay on the ground. Ethan threw a glass of orange juice across her back. The cold liquid soaked into her blazer. Victoria leaned closer. "You would be more comfortable somewhere else. You know, places people like you usually go." The phrase held the weight of a deeply rooted belief. It was not the first time someone had spoken to her this way, but it would be the last time she allowed it to stand without consequence. At a nearby table, Marcus Johnson watched the scene unfold. After 25 years at the club, he had witnessed countless moments like this. He clenched his fists, torn between the need to act and the need to protect the job that supported his family. Eleanor Hayes, one of the oldest members, began to rise. Her husband gently pulled her back down. Silence had protected people for generations. Today, that silence would cost them everything. Aisha gathered the last of her documents and stood. She looked each one of them in the eye. Her voice was quiet, but firm. "I understand perfectly. More than you realize." She walked toward the exit. 10 tables separated her from the door. Each step marked the beginning of a consequence none of them could foresee. At the doorway, she paused and turned toward Edward. "See you Monday, Mr. Harrington." Edward frowned. "Monday? I do not know who you are." Aisha offered a thin, cold smile. "You will." And with that, she walked out, leaving behind the final peaceful moment the Harrington family would know for a very long time. Victoria Harrington moved toward Aisha with the certainty of someone who believed the entire world existed for her comfort, her authority, and her approval, and each step she took carried the same calculated disdain she had used for years to maintain control over the Brentwood elite social hierarchy. She stopped behind Aisha's chair and spoke with a quiet, poisonous confidence. "I am the chair of the social committee. I do not recall inviting you." Her voice was steady, polished, and indifferent to the pain she had already caused. Aisha turned slowly, her expression calm but firm, her dignity intact even as cold orange juice still dripped down the back of her blazer. "Mr. Charles Beaumont invited me personally," she said. Her tone was clear, controlled, adult. Victoria laughed as if she had heard the most amusing lie of the morning. "A verbal invitation. How convenient." She reached down, grabbed a printed page from Aisha's table, took in the heading, and began to read aloud in a mocking voice. "Quarterly projections. Strategic infrastructure expansion." Oh my. Her voice turned sharp. "Planning a little corporate infiltration today?" without waiting for a response. She tore the paper into quarters and allowed the pieces to fall at her feet. Ethan saw her action as permission, as encouragement, as a cue. He rushed forward and kicked Aisha's briefcase, hard. The sound echoed across the marble floor as her tablet slid across the surface. Papers scattered, and pens rolled in every direction. Ethan pulled out his phone and began recording with triumph, lighting his face. "Point of view," he said. "When someone thinks she belongs at Brentwood Elite." His voice carried a tone he had learned from his parents, a tone that gleamed with entitlement and the thrill of humiliation. Aisha bent down to gather her papers. Her movements were quiet and deliberate, but inside her chest, a familiar ache stirred, the feeling she had learned as a teenager when she stood alone in spaces designed to keep her out, the ache of being belittled, not for her actions or achievements, but for her identity. Ethan lifted a glass of orange juice and flung it at her back. The cold liquid soaked into her blazer. The gasp from a nearby table was soft, but it existed. It was the first crack in the silence. Marcus Johnson stood near the kitchen doors. He had watched the club for decades. He had watched members glide through these halls with effortless certainty. He had watched countless moments that stung with the same cruelty now happening again. And each one had chipped away at him. On this morning, his hands trembled, not from fear, from recognition. He had stayed for his children, for his grandchildren, for the stability that employers like the Harringtons pretended they generously offered. Now he watched a woman who outranked every member of the club in intelligence, discipline, and capability being treated as if she were an inconvenience that needed to be removed. He inhaled deeply. He said nothing. He told himself silence was safety. But silence weighed heavily on him. At a corner table, Eleanor Hayes, 78, sat rigid with her hands folded in her lap. She had been a member of the club for half a century. She had seen beauty, prestige, tradition, but she had also seen prejudice dressed in pearls and linen when Ethan threw the orange juice. She rose halfway out of her chair, prepared to intervene. Her husband placed a hand on her wrist. "Eleanor, sit." She hesitated. Then she obeyed. But her eyes stayed locked on Aisha's frame, bent over scattered papers, alone in a room filled with people who believed they had the moral right to mistreat her. Victoria circled Aisha like a predator circling prey. Her voice dropped to a low, cold whisper that carried far enough for 3 tables to hear. "What my husband is trying to say, politely, is that you would be more comfortable somewhere else," she said. Her eyes narrowed with deliberate cruelty. "You know, places people like you usually go." The words landed like a strike. Sharp, unmistakable. A direct declaration of how she viewed the world. Aisha picked up the last of her papers. She rose slowly. Her height gave her presence. Her composure gave her power. Her voice was soft, but unbreakable as she looked directly at Victoria. "I understand perfectly," she said. Then she looked at Ethan, then at Edward, then at the tables surrounding her. "More than you realize." She turned toward the exit. Her steps were measured, steady, and grounded in a dignity no one in that room could diminish. Each step marked the beginning of a consequence too large for any of them to imagine. 10 tables stood between her and the door. 10 tables filled with eyes that watched but did not move. The silence felt heavy. It felt complicit. It felt like an old story being told again, in the same pattern, in the same tone, with the same indifference from those who chose comfort over courage. Aisha reached the doorway. She paused. She turned her head slightly toward Edward. "See you Monday, Mr. Harrington." The words were calm and certain. Edward frowned, confused. "Monday? I do not know who you are." Aisha's expression did not change. Her voice remained steady. "You will." She walked out. The glass doors closed behind her. The terrace returned to its quiet hum of privileged conversation. But an unease lingered in the corners, a sense that something irreversible had just happened, a sense that the balance of power they depended on, one that had always favored them, was about to shift. A subtle tremor began, small enough to ignore but strong enough to unsettle. The Harrington family remained at their table. Victoria adjusted her sunglasses. Edward whispered urgently into his phone. Ethan replayed his TikTok clip of Aisha being soaked with orange juice. He laughed. He felt important. He felt admired. What none of them knew was that his video would ignite the storm. What none of them understood was that every cruel word, every action, every recorded moment would soon become evidence. Evidence that would reshape their lives. Evidence that would fracture their reputations. Evidence that would expose the truth hidden beneath the white attire and polished smiles. And the woman they had mocked. Quiet, composed, strategic, was already preparing for Monday because she had not come to Brentwood Elite seeking acceptance. She had come seeking clarity, and clarity had been delivered with unmistakable certainty. Edward Harrington's phone rang 45 minutes after the brunch incident, and the moment he answered, his entire posture shifted from casual arrogance to silent fear as Charles Beaumont's voice came through with an urgency he had never heard from the man who normally spoke with polished ease. Edward, I have received more than a dozen messages about what happened at brunch. I need you to tell me exactly who that woman was. Edward sighed with irritation. Some black woman in jeans claimed you invited her. The silence that followed lasted long enough for Edward to feel a cold unease settle around his ribs. Edward, Beaumont finally said, each word carrying weight. That woman was Dr. Aisha Reynolds. Edward frowned, almost laughing in disbelief. What? No, that cannot be right. Beaumont's voice tightened. She is the CEO of Reynolds Tech, the company your firm is bidding $2.2 billion against. I invited her personally to discuss a $7 million science, technology, engineering, and mathematics initiative commitment. And she was humiliated in front of the entire terrace. The phone nearly slipped from Edward's hand. His breathing changed. His thoughts scattered. He pulled up his browser with frantic urgency and typed her name. The Forbes cover filled his screen instantly. Her face, her resume, her power, all undeniable, and all directly connected to the project that was supposed to secure his family's legacy. Aisha Reynolds. The woman his son had soaked with orange juice. The woman his wife had mocked publicly. The woman he had threatened to remove from the club. Panic struck him with brutal force. Victoria, he called out, his voice sharp and trembling. Come here. Now! Victoria stepped into the room holding her phone, still laughing at Ethan's video, still unaware of the world that was about to collapse beneath her feet. Edward turned his screen toward her. The color drained from her face as she saw the headline, the name, the title, the truth. No, she whispered, this cannot be real. Edward stormed toward Ethan, who sat on the couch, proud of his viral moment. Delete that video now. Do you understand me? Ethan looked up with confusion and pride. Why? It is blowing up. Everyone thinks it is hilarious. He held his phone up. The clip had already surpassed 8,000 views. Comments poured in, laughter, encouragement, cruel excitement from strangers who enjoyed the spectacle of humiliation. But beneath those comments, new reactions had begun. Isn't that the CEO of Reynolds Tech? This looks bad. Rich kid attacking a black woman at a racist club? A rising tide of outrage swelled. Edward knew what it meant. He understood how quickly the narrative could turn. He grabbed his son's phone. You do not understand, he said with a breaking voice. You have no idea what you have done. Victoria tried to speak, but her words faltered, tangled in fear. She scrolled through her own Instagram account, her latest story. A discreet snapshot of Aisha standing with orange juice dripping down her back was still live. It had comments, dozens, then hundreds. Some asked who the woman was. Others called the image cruel, mean-spirited, racist. Victoria tapped delete. Then she checked her messages. Screenshots had already been spread to Twitter, TikTok, and Instagram by people faster and more attentive than she had expected. Her influence became her downfall. Her audience became her witnesses. Her curated perfection became evidence. A notification appeared on Edward's phone. It was an email from Reynolds Tech. We regret to inform you that your firm is no longer under consideration for the Reynolds campus headquarters contract. Effective immediately. Edward dropped into a chair. His hands shook. The project was gone. The future revenue was gone. The trust of his board was gone, and his career now sat on a precipice he could not climb back from. He stared at the wall in stunned silence. A truth he had ignored for years finally confronted him. He had allowed entitlement to take root. He had allowed discrimination to live unchecked in his home. And now, the consequences had arrived at his door with perfect precision. Victoria paced the room in frantic circles, her voice trembling. We can fix this. We can fix this. She cannot do this to us. Edward turned to her with exhausted disbelief. Do you understand who she is? He pointed at the screen. She is not some random guest. She is not a person we can intimidate or charm. She has more power than anyone in this house has ever imagined. Ethan stood in the doorway. His face had changed. The pride was gone. The certainty was gone. He watched his parents fall apart and, for the first time, felt a weight he did not know how to carry. Dad, he whispered. I did not know who she was. Edward stared at his son. You should not have needed to know who she was. You should have known how to treat a person. Ethan swallowed hard. Tears gathered. A rare flicker of self-awareness began to form, but the damage was done. Across Los Angeles, the first wave of headlines began to rise. Billionaire CEO humiliated at Brentwood Elite. Influencer encourages teen in racist prank. Real estate mogul's son films assault for TikTok. Edward's phone lit up again. This time, it was his senior vice president, then his general counsel, then a board member, then a client, then another. Each call carried the same message: alarm, disappointment, anger, uncertainty. The foundation of Harrington real estate began to crack, not from a financial collapse, but from a moral reckoning sharpened by the digital age. Victoria sank onto the couch. Her hands shook. She thought of the brunch, the confidence she felt, the superiority she believed she had earned. She thought of how easily she had laughed when Ethan threw the croissant. She thought of the pleasure she felt when she tore Aisha's document apart. And then she thought of Aisha's final words. See you Monday. Victoria whispered them aloud. The sound trembled. Ethan wiped his face with his sleeve and stood frozen, unsure of what to do. For the first time, he felt the true weight of consequence. Outside the Harrington home, the world spun forward, screens lit up with the video of the croissant, the laughter, the cruelty. Millions of strangers now held a window into the truth. And Aisha Reynolds, the woman they had tried to humiliate, was already preparing to reveal the rest of the story. The storm had only begun, and the Harrington family was already drowning. By Monday morning, the quiet world the Harrington family once controlled had already collapsed into a relentless storm of headlines, commentary, and nationwide outrage. And as the sun rose over Los Angeles, Dr. Aisha Reynolds walked into the Reynolds Tech auditorium with a calm steadiness that contrasted sharply against the chaos outside. 40 journalists waited. 8 television crews stood ready. Cameras glowed with cold blue light. The room held the stillness that precedes revelation. Aisha stepped to the podium in a charcoal suit, her hair in a smooth chignon, her posture unshakable. She greeted the room with a single nod, then she pressed play on the recording captured at Brentwood Elite. The audio filled the air, the croissant hitting her head, the sharp laughter from Victoria, the triumphant cry from Ethan, the cold directive from Edward. The silence in the room deepened with each second. At 30 seconds, a reporter lowered his eyes. At 2 minutes, another pressed her lips together, fighting emotion. At 10 minutes, the truth felt undeniable. At 28 minutes, the entire room understood the depth of cruelty inflicted on a woman who had arrived that day to quietly assess the club's culture before donating $7 million to support the very children the club claimed to champion. When the recording ended, Aisha folded her hands. Her voice was steady. "I hold a Stanford doctorate. I built this company from a garage. I employ 15,000 people. Yet on Saturday, I was treated as less than human because I am a black woman in simple clothes." Her tone carried no anger, only truth, only clarity, only the weight of a reality millions had endured in silence. The reporters did not shout questions at once. Instead, the room paused as if absorbing an emotional blow. The first question came quietly. "Dr. Reynolds, what do you want the public to understand today?" Aisha answered with calm precision. "I want them to understand that success does not protect anyone from discrimination, and that silence, however polite, is also violence." Outside, social media ignited with new force. Ethan's TikTok had reached 22 million views. The comment section had transformed from casual amusement to fierce condemnation. People dissected every second. They analyzed Ethan's smirk. They replayed Victoria's clapping. They quoted Edward's words. Brentwood racism became the leading topic nationwide by noon. Former employees of the Harrington firm began sharing their own stories. Anonymous accounts posted clips of past incidents at the club. A groundskeeper described years of being addressed as boy. A former applicant revealed she had been rejected for cultural mismatch. A biracial member described being questioned repeatedly about whether she belonged on the tennis courts. The narrative widened. The pattern emerged. And the Harrington name now stood at the center of a storm that showed no sign of slowing. That same morning, Edward arrived at Reynolds Tech holding a bouquet of large white roses wrapped in expensive paper, his desperation obvious in every step he took toward the receptionist's desk. The receptionist greeted him with a practiced smile. She was young, black, professional. Her expression remained warm, but her words were final. "I am sorry, Mr. Harrington. Dr. Reynolds' schedule has changed. Permanently." Edward tried to plead, but she lifted her hand gently. Her tone remained respectful. There is nothing further to arrange. She turned to her computer and ended the conversation with quiet grace. Edward stepped back, stunned. The humiliation he had inflicted on Aisha now turned back on him with measured dignity. That evening, in a final attempt to salvage what he believed he could still control, Edward called Aisha directly. His voice shook as he offered a private settlement. $3 million. "We can resolve this quietly," he said. "We can fix this before it becomes worse." Aisha listened silently. She recorded the call. When he finished, she responded with unwavering calm. "This is not about money. It never was." She ended the call without raising her voice. Edward stood in his kitchen staring at his reflection in the dark glass of the window, realizing he had lost the one woman whose respect he needed most. Meanwhile, the video spread beyond the United States. Media outlets in Europe, Asia, and Africa ran full segments about the incident. Civil rights groups mobilized. Parents posted videos expressing fear that their children would face what Aisha had faced. Women described similar moments of humiliation. Men described being dismissed or questioned simply for existing in the wrong space. The story became a mirror, a painful, unfiltered mirror. The Harrington family's life unraveled with breathtaking speed. Victoria's Instagram followers dropped by 40,000 in a single week. Luxury brands terminated sponsorships. Her inbox filled with canceled partnerships. Worse, leaked screenshots from her private group chats emerged. Messages mocking applicants of color. Comments about staff members. Remarks that exposed a pattern of disdain she had long masked behind polished images and curated posts. Her reputation collapsed publicly. Her confidence collapsed privately. She turned to wine to quiet the panic. But the panic did not quiet. Ethan faced consequences as well. His private academy reviewed the footage and expelled him by Wednesday. Their statement was brief. "This behavior violates our values." At his new public school, classmates recognized him instantly. Someone threw a sandwich at him in the cafeteria. "That is for Dr. Reynolds," the student shouted. Ethan froze, for the first time. He understood, in a painful and unfamiliar way, what humiliation felt like when directed at him instead of from him. He tasted his own cruelty reflected back. At home, the Harrington mansion grew silent. Curtains stayed closed. Phone calls went unanswered. Edward paced the hallways, calculating numbers, options, lawsuits, and losses. Victoria sat at her vanity, staring at her reflection as if seeing herself for the first time. Not the influencer, not the social gatekeeper, not the polished symbol of elite perfection, but the woman who had laughed while a child threw food at a stranger who turned out to be the most powerful woman she had ever met. Edward watched his family unravel and finally understood how fragile privilege truly was. The storm outside grew louder. The pressure inside grew heavier. And somewhere across the city, Aisha began preparing for the next step. Not out of revenge, but out of responsibility. Because she understood something the Harringtons had never learned. Power is temporary, character is permanent. And the world had already chosen which one it valued more. The legal consequences began with a single signature, delivered quietly but decisively, as civil rights attorney Elena Vargas filed the first lawsuit against the Harrington family. And from that moment forward, a chain of events unfolded with the weight and precision of a system long overdue for accountability. The suit named Victoria, Edward, and Ethan for assault, battery, defamation, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. Each claim carried a detailed account of the brunch incident. Each allegation was supported by audio, video, and witness testimony. Each page reflected the truth they had tried to deny. The lawsuit became public within an hour. Reporters camped outside the courthouse. Commentators analyzed every line. And the story that had begun as a viral clip of cruelty now evolved into a full-scale legal reckoning. The American Civil Liberties Union soon joined with a separate class action suit on behalf of families of color who had been denied membership at Brentwood Elite. Their stories came forward one by one. A black surgeon rejected for cultural incompatibility. A Latino entrepreneur told he would not feel comfortable here. An Indian-American couple dismissed with the phrase "membership is full," even as two white families were accepted the next week. These accounts formed a pattern too consistent to ignore. A pattern that stretched back decades. A pattern the Harrington family had always benefited from. The Department of Justice opened its own inquiry within 72 hours. Federal investigators arrived at the club to review records, membership criteria, and internal emails. They conducted interviews with staff members who had remained silent for years. Some spoke with tears in their eyes. Others spoke with exhaustion. All carried stories they had hidden to protect their jobs. The investigation widened. The club's leadership bristled. Attorneys were hired. Public relations firms were engaged. But the facts did not soften under scrutiny. They hardened. At the center of this storm stood Marcus Johnson, the longtime club manager who had served quietly and faithfully for 25 years. He had endured more than anyone in that building. He had watched members dismiss him without greeting. He had watched them speak over him. He had watched young employees of color quit after being mistreated, and he had told himself he would endure for the sake of his family's future. But when federal investigators asked him what he witnessed at the brunch, he took a deep breath and chose the truth. "I have stayed silent for many years," he said, his voice steady but heavy. But Saturday was the final straw. His testimony broke open everything the club had tried to hide. His words became the foundation of the federal inquiry. His courage became the turning point in a story built on silence. Eleanor Hayes testified next. She was 78 years old. She had been a member for half a century. She had attended weddings, fundraisers, and memorials on those grounds. She had played bridge on those terraces. She had watched generations grow up within those walls. But she had also watched the quiet cruelty that lived beneath the club's polish. She stepped into the courtroom with trembling hands. She lifted her chin before speaking. "I am ashamed I stayed silent," she said. "I saw the entire incident. I saw what that young boy did. I saw what Victoria encouraged. I saw what Edward demanded. And I remained seated." Her voice cracked. She pressed forward. "But I am standing now." Her testimony brought tears to the courtroom. It also brought clarity. The truth had witnesses, and the silence had broken. Meanwhile, the Harrington family faced consequences inside their own home. Ethan was expelled from his elite private academy within 2 days of the investigation's news coverage. The school's statement was brief. "The behavior displayed in the documented video is incompatible with our values." Ethan did not speak for several hours after reading the letter. He sat at the dining table, staring at the expulsion notice, his face pale, his breath shallow. The pride he once felt had vanished. In its place lived confusion, regret, and a fear he did not know how to express. When he entered his new public school, the shift in atmosphere was immediate. Students recognized him instantly. Whispers followed him down the hallway. Stares lingered. And on the third day, someone threw a sandwich at him during lunch. It landed against his shoulder with a soft, humiliating thud, a cruel echo of his own actions. The student shouted, "That is for Dr. Reynolds." Ethan froze. His throat tightened. He realized, perhaps for the first time, that humiliation did not lose its sting when directed at someone else. It multiplied when returned. Victoria suffered consequences of a different kind. She lost more than 40,000 followers in 1 week. Her sponsorships evaporated. Her email filled with contract cancellations. Screenshots of her private group chat messages surfaced online. Comments mocking applicants. Remarks about staff appearances. Photos she had sent while laughing about club standards. The world saw the truth she had hidden behind filters and captions. Her reputation collapsed with ruthless speed. In private, she turned to wine to numb the panic rising inside her chest. She cried alone. She whispered apologies to no one in particular. She replayed the recording in her mind. She heard her own laughter, her own clapping, her own words. She wondered how she had become someone she could no longer defend. Edward watched the consequences unfold with a growing sense of dread. His firm received notice that 3 major clients were reconsidering their contracts. Their concerns were clear: reputation, liability, trust. Numbers began to fall. Emails poured in. Board members demanded meetings. Silence carried definition. Silence carried judgment. Silence carried threat. At home, Edward moved like a man standing on unstable ground. He understood business. He understood money, but he did not understand how quickly character could outweigh both. Aisha, meanwhile, prepared for each legal proceeding with calm strategy. She did not seek revenge. She sought responsibility. She sought reform, she sought truth, and she understood the magnitude of what was unfolding. She met with Elena Vargas, she met with community leaders, she met with civil rights organizations, she met with families hurt by the same patterns of discrimination now exposed to the world. She carried her own pain quietly but purposefully. She carried the weight of her community with dignity and resolve. The lawsuits proceeded, the investigations expanded, and across Los Angeles, and across the nation. The story grew into something larger than one brunch, one insult, or one act of cruelty. It became a story about systems, about silence, about privilege, about consequence, and about a reckoning long overdue. The trial began with a solemn gravity that filled every corner of the courtroom, and as the first week unfolded, it became clear that the Harrington family stood not only before a judge, but before the judgment of a nation awakening to long-ignored truths about power, prejudice, and the damage they leave behind. The proceedings stretched across 4 intense weeks, each day bringing new testimonies, new evidence, and new revelations that stripped away the illusion of respectability the Harringtons had relied on for so long. Elena Vargas presented the recording first, the croissant, the laughter, the orange juice, the words, the humiliation. The jurors watched with expressions that shifted from disbelief to sorrow to anger as they realized the depths of cruelty inflicted on a woman who had come that day to offer support, generosity, and opportunity. The defense attempted to argue that the incident had been exaggerated. They attempted to shift blame. They attempted to minimize the harm. But every attempt collapsed under the weight of undeniable proof. Witness after witness stepped forward. Marcus Johnson described years of quiet discrimination. He spoke of the way some members addressed him without looking at him. He spoke of the small humiliations, the subtle exclusions, the expectations that he remained silent to keep his job. He told the court how he had watched Aisha stand alone that morning. He told them how he felt a breaking inside him. His testimony carried the weight of decades. It broke something in the room. Eleanor Hayes testified next. Her hands trembled as she took the oath. She told the court she had seen the entire scene unfold. She admitted she had remained seated out of habit, out of fear, and out of the long-standing culture of silence she had once accepted as normal. "But I am standing now," she said, her voice breaking, "and I will not sit again." The courtroom fell silent. Even the judge paused before speaking. Former employees of the Harrington firm testified as well. Stories of aggressive boardroom behavior, stories of exclusion disguised as professionalism, stories that revealed not one isolated incident, but a pattern shaped by entitlement and unchecked authority. The jury deliberated for only 5 hours. Their decision was direct, firm, unequivocal. The Harrington family was found liable for $10 million in damages, $4 million compensatory, $6 million punitive. Victoria's hand shook when the verdict was read. Ethan stared at the table. Edward swallowed hard, his face drained of color. But the civil verdict was only the beginning. Criminal charges followed. The prosecution presented its case with precision. Ethan's role was undeniable. Victoria's encouragement was recorded. Edward's threat was captured on audio. The judge sentenced them to 250 hours of community service each, 4 years of probation, and mandatory anti-bias education. Ethan received 2 years of intensive therapy and community service focused on supporting underprivileged youth of color. The courtroom watched him closely as the sentence was read. For the first time, he cried without shame. His parents could not comfort him. They could not comfort themselves. Outside the courthouse, cameras captured the beginning of the next chapter of their downfall. Harrington real estate lost 45% of its market value within 3 months. Major clients canceled or paused $40 million in contracts. Board members confronted Edward behind closed doors. The conversation lasted less than 10 minutes when he emerged. He no longer carried the title of CEO. His nameplate was removed that afternoon. The layoffs began the next week. 150 employees, people with mortgages, families, plans, dreams, people who had nothing to do with the brunch, people who now paid the price for the arrogance of those at the top. Edward sat alone in his empty office on his final day. Staring out at the skyline he once believed he commanded. He wondered when he had become a man who could not recognize right from wrong until it was too late. The losses continued. Their $18 million Bel Air mansion went on the market. It sold at auction for far less than its value. They moved into a modest two-bedroom rental in Sherman Oaks, a far cry from the marble floors and sweeping staircases they once considered normal. Victoria struggled to adjust to a life without influence, without brand partnerships, without followers praising her daily posts. She applied for jobs. Each application exposed the visible stain of her public downfall. The only offer came from Nordstrom, cosmetics counter, entry-level, uniform required. Her manager was Tasha Brooks, a poised black woman of 32, on Victoria's first day. Tasha greeted her with a steady voice. "Welcome to the team, Mrs. Harrington." Victoria nodded softly. No instinct to correct her, no instinct to claim authority, only the quiet acknowledgement that the world she once controlled had shifted beyond her reach. In therapy, Ethan began confronting the roots of his behavior. He spoke of the pressure to mirror his parents. He spoke of the admiration he mistook for love. He spoke of how it felt to be hated by strangers for actions he barely understood. And he spoke of the guilt he carried for hurting a woman who had shown him nothing but dignity in return. His therapist told him he had the chance to become someone different, someone better, someone who learned from the cost of cruelty. His tears came easily then. They fell not from shame alone, but from the realization that he wanted to change. Edward found work consulting on affordable housing projects. The irony was not lost on him. It was the only field where his reputation had not been completely destroyed. He sat through meetings with community leaders. He listened to stories he had never heard before, stories of redlining, stories of rejection, stories of families forced out of neighborhoods by people like him. He felt the weight of a legacy he had inherited without question, and for the first time, he questioned all of it. The Harringtons' downfall did not end with a single verdict or a single headline. It stretched across months. It reshaped their lives. It stripped away the illusions they had built around wealth, privilege, and superiority. It forced them to confront the truth of who they had been, and it pushed them, painfully, reluctantly, into becoming something else, across the city. Aisha moved steadily forward with her work, her mission, and her purpose. She had not sought their destruction. She had sought accountability, and accountability had arrived, not with cruelty, but with clarity, because consequences are not revenge. They are the reflection of choices, and the Harringtons were now living inside the reflection they had created. The aftermath of the trial reached far beyond the Harrington family, as Brentwood Elite Country Club confronted the consequences of its long-hidden culture, and under the pressure of public outrage, federal scrutiny, and internal revelations, the club agreed to a sweeping settlement that reshaped the very foundation of its identity. The class action case brought by the American Civil Liberties Union ended with a $15 million agreement, a historic figure for a private institution that once prided itself on exclusivity. The terms required the club to overhaul its membership structure entirely. At least 35% of new members over the next 5 years had to be people of color. A full-time diversity officer needed to be hired. Quarterly bias training became mandatory. Anonymous reporting channels were established. The board created new scholarship programs for underrepresented youth. 60 years of tradition began to shift, yet not everyone accepted the change. 58 long-standing members resigned in protest, declaring that the club had lost its character. Their departures revealed the deeper truth that the club's character had been shaped not by excellence, but by exclusion, and for the first time in its history. Brentwood elite chose transformation over nostalgia, as the reforms took root. Dr. Aisha Reynolds turned her attention toward something far larger than the settlement she had won. She used a portion of her legal victory to establish the Beyond the Dress Code initiative, a $25 million program dedicated to providing science, technology, engineering, and mathematics initiative scholarships and leadership training for students of color and young women who showed ambition but lacked opportunity. She announced the initiative at a national civil rights conference before an audience of thousands. She spoke with quiet power. "I had the resources to fight back," she said. "Most people do not, so I fight for them." Her voice echoed with resolve. Her message resonated across the country. The initiative quickly became a model for corporations seeking to address systemic inequities with more than statements and promises. Meanwhile, the Harrington family struggled to build a new life from the ruins of their old one. Victoria continued working at the Nordstrom cosmetics counter. Each shift began with her tying her apron, smoothing the front of her uniform, and stepping into a role that required humility rather than influence. Customers treated her as an employee, not an icon. Some recognized her from the scandal, some did not. But every interaction forced her to confront the truth she had long avoided. Respect must be earned, not curated, not commanded, earned. She began therapy, encouraged by her manager, Tasha Brooks, the same woman she once would have dismissed without a glance. Their relationship evolved slowly, shaped by mutual professionalism and quiet acknowledgement of the past. Victoria listened more, spoke less, and carried herself with a softness she had never shown in public before. Edward's new consulting work exposed him to the side of real estate development he had never cared to understand. Affordable housing meetings, community forums, policy discussions. He listened to stories from families displaced by rising prices. He listened to young professionals struggling to find homes. He listened to advocates who had fought for years to gain a seat at the table. For the first time, he understood how deeply the industry he led had shaped lives in ways he had never noticed. His role was smaller now, but his awareness was greater. He sent personal apology emails to all 150 employees laid off after the collapse of his company. It did not fix the damage, but he sent them anyway, because silence was no longer acceptable. Ethan's transformation unfolded in a different way. His court-ordered therapy forced him to confront the source of his behavior. He spoke about growing up in a home where privilege was unquestioned and superiority was taught not with lessons, but with example. He admitted he had mimicked what he saw. He admitted he had laughed because his mother laughed. He admitted he had acted because he believed he was untouchable. His therapist helped him unlearn what had been taught so naturally and slowly. He began to understand empathy, to fulfill his community service requirement. Ethan began volunteering at a youth center in South Central Los Angeles, the same neighborhood where Aisha had grown up. At first, he moved with discomfort, unsure of how he would be received. But the children welcomed him without judgment. They asked about coding. They asked about robotics. They asked about things he knew. And for the first time, he felt the joy of helping instead of hurting. A year after the trial, during a community event celebrating the science, technology, engineering, and mathematics initiative program funded by Aisha's initiative, Ethan approached her quietly. His posture was nervous. His voice was soft. "I am sorry," he said. "I am truly sorry." Aisha studied him for a long moment. She saw sincerity, fear, growth, and the fragile beginnings of a different kind of boy than the one who had thrown the orange juice. Her voice remained calm. "Do not apologize to me. Change your behavior. That is the only apology that matters." Ethan nodded, tears forming. He understood. Across the city. The skyline of Los Angeles reflected the shifting light of evening as Aisha stood on the rooftop of Reynolds Tech's new headquarters, a campus built by a minority-owned contractor she had personally selected after withdrawing the Harrington bid. The building stood as a symbol of possibility, resilience, and the power of choosing principle over convenience. The wind moved softly around her, below her. Cars flowed through the streets. Lights flickered in distant windows. Life continued with its steady rhythm. She looked out over the city she had fought so hard to rise within, the city that had challenged her, the city that had shaped her, the city she had chosen to hold accountable, she whispered to herself, almost as a vow. Privilege has no dress code, neither does dignity, but accountability always does. Her words drifted into the night air with quiet certainty. She closed her eyes for a brief moment, not in exhaustion, but in gratitude for the clarity the journey had brought. Because change, she knew, does not come from anger alone. It comes from courage, from truth, from action, and from the willingness to confront the world as it is. In order to build the world as it should be, the city moved beneath her, imperfect, complicated, human, but undeniably changed. One story, one consequence, and one act of courage at a time. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, please subscribe, give the video a like, and share it with someone who needs to hear it.